I'm Heidi Henderson, the Fossil Huntress, and your host for BC's Fossil Bounty. Join in the exploration of the fascinating science of paleontology, that lens that examines ancient animals, plants, and ecosystems, from wee single-cell organisms to big and mighty dinosaurs.
I'm Catherine Hickson, volcanologist. Welcome to BC's Fossil Bounty. I look at landscapes, and landscapes for me are the fossils. The landscapes tell me what has happened here eons ago.
How did those tectonic plates form? That story begins with the birth of our Earth. Our planet is 4.6 billion years old. It began as a swirling pool of dust, spinning and condensing into a molten core. Earth's early atmosphere slowly cooled our world, and a crust began to form. Not a hard, fixed crust, but one broken at the edges, pushing and pulling continents and forming our mountains.
I have a particular kind of fossil I'm going to be talking to you about today, and that's landforms. Because landforms are like fossils. They tell us about the ancient history of the land that we live in. I'm a scientist, and I study landforms. Yes, I have a specific talent, and that's in volcanoes, but in fact, volcanoes are part of a much broader landscape interpretation. I like to say maybe I'm a landscape whisperer, and that is understanding the landscape in terms of how it actually affects us as individuals, as communities. How do we live in this landscape? We know about earthquakes, and we know about volcanoes, and we know about rivers and glaciers. The land that we are on right now has this amazing geological history. This landscape has been sculpted actually over millions of years by what we call tectonic forces. Plate tectonics are these amazing force that actually forms our landscape. So plate tectonics is what creates the mountains, what creates the deep valleys. When I say plate tectonics, what do I mean? I mean, other than the occasional earthquake, we think that we're walking around on solid ground, and we hear that lots of times, solid ground. But in fact, we're not. We are very slowly actually moving towards the west. We're heading for Japan. But unfortunately, there's another plate called the Pacific Plate, which is heading to the north, and the Juan de Fuca Plate is heading almost straight at us. So these are big chunks of crust, and those big chunks of crust are moving in different directions. When they crash together, we get mountain ranges. Every time the mountain goes up, we have an earthquake. Those earthquakes are telling us that those plates are crashing together and in fact forcing the ground surface upward. So if you are anywhere in the world, not just here in BC, but if you're anywhere in the world and you happen to be standing and looking at majestic mountains around you, you can thank plate tectonics for those majestic mountains.
Volcanologists collect data about volcanic activity and then study these findings. Then they look at this data in a laboratory to understand why volcanoes behave the way they do and to predict future eruptions for the safety of local populations. Some will also study the geological history of a particular volcano, and depending on where they live and work, this might mean exotic travel to places like Iceland to see active volcanoes in action, or it may be closer to home. For those studying volcanoes in the Vancouver area, this means places like Mount Garibaldi or, surprise, Queen Elizabeth Park. You may have visited Queen Elizabeth Park to walk the grounds and enjoy the plant life. It was once known as Little Mountain, built from volcanic basalt. Years ago, this area that is now a lush garden and path, pools and greenery, was an active quarry, the Little Mountain Quarry. If you were looking for that basalt today, you'd want to wander down to Gastown's historic Water Street or other lanes. Most of Little Mountain's basalt was quarried and crushed to build the roads more than 100 years ago.
But of course, with those majestic mountains comes other things. And one of those other things, in addition to the earthquakes, is volcanoes. A volcanologist is somebody who tries to understand and interpret volcanoes. So if you have a volcanic problem or hear about a volcano going off, I'm the one you call. When I look at Vancouver, what I see is this landscape. I see the hills. I see Queenie Mountain. That is actually there because of volcanoes. Because that plate pushing underneath, deep down beneath Earth's surface, it actually starts to melt rock below, forming magma. That magma then climbs and finds its way up to the surface and creates volcanoes. And those volcanoes do more change to our landscape in a number of different ways. One is by exploding, basically creating ash and dust, which is then hurled high up into the atmosphere and can travel for tens of thousands of kilometers. I had an experience actually as a student. I took my geology here at the University of British Columbia. While I was a student, Mount St. Helens started to rumble. And of course, it was the talk of every geology department across North America. Because we're close enough here, my husband and I, we headed down south and were there to witness that eruption. So saw it from its earliest moments, this amazing, unbelievable sight unfolding before me. At first it was, oh my goodness, this is what I've been studying. This is what all these textbooks have been talking about. We ran forward to a little bit better vantage place while we were in awe of what we were seeing. We were quite a ways away. We were actually 14 kilometers away. And you can think, I mean, that's like being in downtown Vancouver and looking towards the North Shore Mountains. But very quickly, as the volcano was erupting in front of us, the mountain disappeared. And the ash was shooting out now tens of kilometers into the sky. We could smell sort of a very dry, pulverized smell. But in a fraction of seconds, that eruption, it grew and it grew and it grew. And as it grew, we realized that we were actually in grave danger. So we were fleeing. We had to stop at one point, and at that point, I was left on the side of the road. As I was standing there, what I could hear was this incredible roar in the background. I was completely blind. It was like being in a fog, a very thick fog, as the ash itself sifted down around me with this roar and this rumble in the background. Punctuating that roar was these incredible cracks, and I would look up through the fog of ash and think, is a very large chunk of the mountain going to land on me now? Fortunately, it didn't. I'm here to talk to you more than 40 years later from that eruption. But I can still close my eyes and visualize every minute second, every minute thing that happened during that amazing eruption. I wasn't a geologist then, I was a student, but that was a critical point in terms of my education. I realized at that point that I needed to understand volcanoes better. I needed to understand what this incredible eruption was and how it affected both me and the surrounding areas. So that's why I became a volcanologist.
Fire and ice, tectonic forces deep within the earth, spawned by the fire from below. And these created mountains and formed the deep valleys that bared their chests to be molded by glaciers. But glaciers didn't carve away everything. Some rocks were easier to sculpt and shape than others, and some were more difficult. The variation in these rocky bones has left us with an incredible variety in the world we see today, and upon which our biological world now makes its home.
So plate tectonics, in addition to creating the massive mountains that we see around us, also create the volcanoes. Mount Baker is the closest one to us. If you happen to be out the valley and can look up to the east, and you'll see Mount Baker, a beautiful, majestic volcano that soars above the skyline. Mount Baker is one of the very young volcanoes, but we have older volcanoes, and those older volcanoes, the evidence of them has been washed away or rubbed away, scrubbed away, eroded away by massive layers of ice. The volcanoes and in fact, the mountains, they form various kinds of different climates, different topographies, different ways that the atmosphere interacts with the landscape. And where we have that interaction, creating glaciers, and a lot of glaciers, that's where we have these buildups. So if we go far, far to the north, up to our polar regions or Antarctica, you find massive amounts of ice. And when those thick ice masses move, they move so very slowly, but they grind and grind away at the surface of the ground. And as they grind away, they create different kinds of sculpted landscapes. How do we know that, in fact, those glaciers were here? We can see them in the shiny, polished rocks. We can see them in the rounded summits, the lions, for example. We can see the evidence that, in fact, a few thousands of years ago, we were buried here under about 2 kilometers of ice. So after Mount St. Helens, I finished my studies on the volcanoes of British Columbia, and my focus was the Wells Gray Park just north of Kamloops. And that park actually has this amazing array of incredibly subglacial volcanoes. So these are volcanoes that actually grew in conjunction with deep, thick glacial ice. So that led me to look at other volcanoes around British Columbia. And in fact, British Columbia has this incredible wealth of volcanoes, but they're subtle. They're not the Mount Fujis or the Mount Bakers that we see. Mount Garibaldi is a nice kind of stratovolcano, but it has a very complex history. And that complex history includes explosions like we saw at Mount St. Helens. It includes lava that flowed out over the glacier. And in fact, if you travel the highway between Vancouver and Whistler, you'll see even more evidence of this amazing volcanic heritage that we have around us that is all about fire interacting with ice, creating very specific, very unique landforms. We probably have more of them than almost any other place on Earth other than Iceland. But in fact, the name of these subglacial volcanoes is called a tuya. That's a T-U-Y-A. And a tuya is a specific kind of volcano that grew underneath glacial ice. And in fact, that name comes from northern BC, the Tuya-Teslin country, where there is a place called Tuya Butte. And that was, in fact, the first place where it was really understood what these kinds of volcanoes look like. They're flat-topped and steep-sided, and they formed in association with the glaciers. Both John Clegg and myself had the great good fortune to work with Bill Matthews from the University of British Columbia. So I was a student of Bill's, and John was a close colleague. And Bill worked in the Tuya-Teslin country. He was mapping. And he was the one that really identified that there was this strong association but he couldn't completely put it together. He had a trip, so we're talking back in the 1940s. He happened to be in Iceland. And when he was in Iceland, he realized that the key, the understanding of how you get flat-topped, steep-sided volcanoes came from their association with glaciers. And he has this amazing ability to understand landforms, to synthesize, to put together how, in fact, the landforms that we see around us have been created. Putting together that amazing background and understanding of both Bill and John have been very instrumental for me in terms of my understanding and my ability to interpret landscapes.
Catherine's work helps us to understand the world around us, the ancient geological outcrops that speak to dinosaurs and volcanoes, both crucial to the physical and biological world we now inhabit. Volcanoes formed our atmosphere, but it was the plants that filtered out the CO2, making it more conductive to life forms and the humans that populate the world today.
So geology is about the world that we live in. And understanding the geology helps you understand, what does this landscape mean to you as a person? What does it mean as we look at the landscape, as we look at what's in the landscape, particularly fossils? Now, I've used the analogy that the landforms are a type of fossils, but of course we know that fossils also include animals, plants, vegetation that was part of the landscape and has now been preserved because of the geological forces. If we look at specifics, if we look at Stanley Park, the reason that Stanley Park is there is because of its geology. It is made up of actually relatively soft sediments, but those soft sediments are held up, they're buttressed, they're reinforced by magma. And magma is simply liquid rock that's come to the surface or near the surface, in the case of Stanley Park, and it's solidified. And it's formed an armor. So those of you that know Siwash rock, well, Siwash rock is armored by a plate of lava hardened deep underground. Some of you might have gone for a walk in Queenie Park and have seen these very amazing columnar joints that are there. What do we mean by columnar joints? These are rocks that have a very peculiar and specific shape to them. So they're actually shaped like pentagons, so they're five-sided, and that is an indication that they started their life as liquid and then cooled. But they're really, really hard. They're much harder than all the rocks that are around them, all the sediments that have been laid down by the ancient rivers or the ancient glaciers. Those hard rocks are in fact what create Queenie Park, that hill that we see. So that landform that is part of what we experience as Vancouverites, as British Columbians. They're part of why there's a park there. There isn't houses because there's bedrock, it's hard, very close by. And it forms part of us, part of how we live in this landscape. My passion is obviously for volcanoes, but I think it's important for people to really appreciate and understand all aspects of the landscape, whether it be dinosaur bones, or whether it be fossil shells, or pollen grains that are preserved in the sediments that tell us about the ancient climates. So how do we understand those? We want to understand them from the context of how they fit. How do they help us understand the world that we live in right now? We can do that in a number of different ways. As a geologist, we're looking at them from a scientific perspective. As an artist, you can look at them from what their context is, how you can portray them graphically. Where does your passion? Are you a biologist? Are you a marine ecologist? Where do you fit into the great scheme of things in terms of understanding our environment with its geological underpinnings, its bones that lie below us? And then, of course, there's a very important link with First Nations, and particularly a link with First Nations with volcanoes. And that is because the volcanoes have created material that is used by First Nations people. One of them is obsidian. So obsidian has been used for stone tools. They're not fossils, but they're archaeological artifacts that are very important to understanding the First Nations history. And there's other things like ochre. So ochre is actually formed from iron. The rocks, which are rich in iron, they seep out when we have springs and things like that, and they form ochre deposits. And that ochre was used for ceremonial purposes, painting people, painting artifacts. So all of this comes together in a much broader context in terms of understanding our landscape, understanding why we're here, why the Fraser River is here, why Mount Baker is here, and how we can in fact better appreciate and better interpret our landscape. This is how I would encourage you to think about geology. Think about all of those aspects. It's been a great pleasure, and I hope that you've been able to learn something from this series about your landscape, about the fossils, about this amazing world that we live in.
Dr. Catherine Hickson is a volcanologist and geologist, and she studies our world with a very particular lens, from volcanoes to looking at outcrops and landscapes. She brings us a viewpoint that enriches our world.